I seek to honor stories that live on a time spectrum. I've noticed, especially, within the last year or two, people really siloing in cultural work to futurism as well as to honoring the past. And I'm like, for me, where the resonance is across the entire timeline. I want to see, and I am committed to laboring to stories that honor the past while making meaning of the present and visioning liberated and loving futures. I don't want either or. I want all of that, all of that. I think part of it is because as I was fortifying my story practices, I got really great mentorship at the Banff Center in Canada. And a mentor there said, here's my encouragement. Every project moving forward, every community-based project moving forward, make sure that you include consciously the voices, the lived experiences, and the stories, and the perspectives and wisdom of youth and of elders. And I was like, what, say more about that. What's behind it? And he was like, here's the deal. Young people are forward facing, and it seasons everything about their lived experience, their perspectives, their desires, their drive. Elders, they have decades. Like, you don't even have to go to an archive. They are the archive. Mm-hmm. So skipping that is definitely skipping two fundamental treasures. So that's how I wound up with that whole spectrum piece around time with my story work. And then I would say, I think because I work exclusively with marginalized communities, that's where the themes come into play and practice, where I'm like, okay, it's not enough just to tell our challenging stories, tell the stories that contributed to our marginalizations. There's the activist in me that says, how do we use these stories to actually transform the reality that is marginalizing us? So how do we want to tell the stories? Who do we want them to reach? That has to be connected with the amplification and the archive pieces, the methodologies, who I collaborate with. That's why I was so excited to meet you, because you were the very first genuine archivist who is community-based. I felt like it was an uphill battle to get people to understand it makes no sense working with marginalized communities on these story projects that wind up being amplified in an academic institution if you have undocumented people. How are they, what documentation are they going to show to get into the archive? That's a barrier. If you have people of color who, in general, are not showing up to repositories. Why? Because repositories, the activation around it, I hate to say it, but historically it has not been there. So these are physical spaces that house our stories that we don't even access. So to ask for money and to ask for time and to ask for the resources to build community-based stories that don't get returned to the communities, I'm like, no, that doesn't sound hot. No, I'm not part of that. So instead, I just was always like, I'm going to collaborate with the most amazing cultural workers who will center from the very beginning these stories being accessible to every single person who contributed their voice and their story to the project. That's how I wound up collaborating with muralists and community chefs and seed savers and just everybody, DJs. I mean,
because they're the culture makers, right? And the archive, as we know it, I always tell people, like, archives can be sites of violence because, like, literally because of what you said. They take and extract the stories, but the folks who are the subjects don't have ownership, nor do they have permission or power dynamic to control how those narratives are. And it's the responsibility of the archive, especially in today's time, because this is where we are, to transform that relationship, right? Mm-hmm. And to start thinking about a reparations-based, justice-based relationship to communities whose intellectual property, cultural property, and stories they hold. And so I'm really grateful for you, because I think about how you do that work You approach it with a lot of care. You believe that trust in between those relationships matters, and there's an intimacy that you approach your story collecting with. And something you had shared was that you don't seek approval or just validation, but you do seek to build true, like, authentic relationship with the folks that you're collecting stories about. And I think one of the things that we know, if we look at the ways that our stories have been collected, it hasn't been on par as like, oh, I see you as an equal. It's I own you, or I can have some control over you, so I can take this narrative from you and do with it as I please. And as people of color, as Black people, as Black women, you know, we definitely have to redirect that energy, shut it down, because our lineage, our legacy is that Black women, we took our narrative into our own hands, wrote our own stories, wrote about our lives ourselves. And that's a revolutionary act, right? To say, this is my voice telling my own story. And so when we are stewards of other people's spaces and stories, how you do that with in an ethical way really does matter. And I think, you know, it's not always about just building a repository to house stuff. It's really also, like, the work is also about transforming the ideas that we have about ourselves as communities, as people, as individuals, to know that we're worthy enough, that our stories deserve respect, and that who may ask us about those stories, they don't always deserve access.